And then after all that, it's time to make a prediction. Before I go and talk a little bit more about the actual prediction on the basis of that training I've showed you, there's two questions people ask me. What if I'm wrong? Well, it's a prediction. The idea of making a prediction, if we go right back to the beginning about the why are we making it? Because we're actually making it to inform our race plan so that we get the best race on the day. So hopefully, if you've really looked at your training and really analysed it in detail, you're not going to be that wrong. And if you are wrong, you'll probably learn from experience. And it might be, as I say, you can learn, well, why was I wrong? What was it in that prediction that I didn't predict? What was it that I actually got wrong in terms of how I assessed the training that I did and how it performed in the race itself? Was it something about the circumstances of the race? Did I not stick to the pacing? Did I miss my nutrition? Was it excessively hot? Were there some massive hills that I just hadn't taken account of? So, if you are wildly wrong, then look back and assess the whole process of how you came to your prediction and the race itself and how you performed in the race to inform you. But ultimately, as I say, the prediction is just that. It's a guide to how you're likely to perform, which is a guide to how to run the best race, which is going to help you be more likely to perform that way. And what if I don't like what it tells me? This is always a really tricky one as a coach. What if I think you want to run 3:30, say, and you think you're in that shape, and I think you're in 4-hour shape? That's a really tricky conversation to have. But again, I feel if you think you're in 3:30 shape and you're actually in 4-hour shape and you set off at 3:30 pace, you're going to have a horrific experience and probably finish way over 4 hours, because you're just going to hemorrhage time because you've paced it wildly wrong. So if you don't like what it tells you, go back, recheck it by all means, go through everything and think, question yourself of that whole process that you've gone through, question your training, and then and look at what conclusion you come to when you've reviewed it. And if you don't like what it tells you, maybe you just have to suck it up and accept that perhaps your training didn't go the way you wanted, or perhaps your initial prediction when you started out on your marathon block was actually overly ambitious. And actually, as your training's progressed, you've realized it's over ambitious, or you've missed gaps in training. So if you don't like what it tells you, you need to perhaps take that forward again, as I say, and reflect. But I think as a coach, it's always better, and it's not a comfortable conversation to have. Although, to be frank, if we rarely get to the stage where it's a bit of a shock right at the end, because again, I think part of the important thing around being a coach and the relationship you have with the athletes and the runners that you coach is honesty and trust and openness throughout the whole process. So we're likely to know as we go through that actually it's not going to happen, unless something catastrophic happens, like you get COVID or you twist an ankle or something like that. Most of the time we know where we're heading before we get to this kind of stage now. So in terms of my marathon run, as you say, a lot of those runs I was doing, just to put a bit of context to it, a lot of the runs I was doing, I actually predicted myself to run 3:27 and I ran 3:29. So it wasn't too bad as a prediction. A lot of the long runs were really kind of the ones which were better pace long runs were about 8:30. But I know I didn't have the endurance across the whole of the training block. And actually, when I looked, I knew that as I went through August, for various reasons, family, work, all of that stuff, actually the training had fallen away. So probably in July, I was much closer to that 3:27 pace. But come the actual race itself, because of those gaps in training, it was going to be a bit of a stretch. Then, if I'm honest, got a little bit overexcited. Shouldn't really do that with my experience, sort of in the first half. And also there was a minute toilet break as well. So that would have made it 3:28. But unfortunately, in a race, you can't stop the time to go to the toilet. And I really needed to go. So that was where I came out. However, I do always, as a caveat, say there are some online predictors. So I always look at the training first, always analyze it. But then I do just like to have a little run through these predictors just to see. My favourite one is Tanda. And the reason I like Tanda is because it's based on training, not race performance. So you do have to do a bit of calculation to work out what your volume is of running, what your average time on feet and distance is. It will give you a race prediction. And then Runner's World Race Predictor is based, it does have a box where you can add in how much weekly mileage that you do, but it's largely based on previous performances in other events. And that one you can manipulate a bit. So, I like to put in my half marathon. And then if it's not what I want as an answer, I might put in my 5K or my 10K until I find an answer I like. That's only for me. Obviously, for a runner, I just go with what I think is the most transferable. But it is worth double checking your answers just to see what they say. And, as I say, just to kind of widen your repertoire. So that is how I do it. And as I say at the start, there is more than one way. It's always a prediction, but hopefully it gives you a bit of a flavour of what I look at and why. So if anybody's got any questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself or use the chat box facility. But if you want me to predict your marathon time, you have to fill out that sheet and that graph and give it to me.
Oh, hi, Joe. It's Bernie Johnson.
Hello, Bernie. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Well, thanks very much for taking us all through that. I don't know what the others, how they get on with their athletes, but I generally get athletes telling me, first of all, what time they want to run a marathon in. And, I want to do this, sub 4 hours, sub 3 hours or whatever. And I noticed that you said at the beginning, if I've understood correctly, you do your prediction at the end of your marathon training. So that was quite interesting.
So I do predict at the start. I predict at the start and then I work through, and then this is my final race plan prediction.
All right. Yeah.
So I think you have to have a working figure at the start. I always say, the one at the start is probably less accurate than the one you're going to arrive at the end. But you need to have a ballpark, unless somebody's a complete and utter beginner. If they've been running a while, you should have a bit of a ballpark figure.
Yeah. And then I guess, it's, well, let's try one first of all, so you can experience it, because it's very hard to describe to anybody who hasn't run one before just what it's like, and then perhaps go from there. But my main question was around, I think you said you ran, the example you gave, you ran about 3.5 hour, just under 3.5 hours for the marathon, which is around an 8-minute mile pace.
It is, yeah.
So it just seems to me, if I want, or anybody wants to run a marathon at 8.5-minute mile pace, you've got to get very good at running and very efficient at running at 8.5-minute miles and be able to sustain that. So clearly you're not going to go out and run 20 miles every week or every other week or build up to that and run your marathon pace, target pace. But you do need to get used to running at that pace. So what's your view on how often you should be trying to run at that target marathon pace and get very good at it?
So personally, what I tend to do, so it always, coaches, we always say it depends. Partly it depends on where you're starting from in terms of the long run, whatever your base long run is. So I would say to people, if you're not in marathon training, what would be the long run that you're doing most weeks? Start from there. And then we know how much we've got to build. So if that's 8 miles, and then you've got to build up to 26. If it's 13 miles, you obviously have to add, you don't need to add quite as much endurance because you've already got a much bigger base. So I start with that. And then the number of weeks that I've got to get there. I like personally to do an alternating pattern. Not that I would stick to this as an absolute 100% rule, but what I try and do is 1 week I will add volume to the long run, and the next week I will do a section of it at marathon pace. So for example, I might do say I've done 14 miles the week before. So this week I'm now doing 16 miles. Next week, I might do 16 miles with 4 miles at marathon pace.
Right.
And then the week after, I might do 18 miles. And then the week after that, I'm doing 18 miles with 6 miles at marathon pace. So I tend to go in that pattern. If I personally like to prioritize building aerobic endurance over everything else. So if it's a runner that's not running a lot and hasn't got a great deal of base behind them before they start the marathon block, I would probably prioritize just getting the time on feet first before I put the marathon pace in there. Because I always think you don't want to, getting injured is your kind of game over, isn't it? So the faster pace you run, the more intensity you run at, the more the risk of injury is. So if I'm going to prioritize, I'm going to prioritize steady aerobic running over marathon pace running. So I have a runner, for example, she had quite a bad injury, and then we were going for the what's the one in Spain, Seville Marathon in quite a short time scale. And actually I just made her do almost entirely steady running with a tiny bit of marathon pace chucked in there. But if you've got somebody that's already got quite a big base, then I'll do a lot more marathon pace running. I was going to say just one other thing. Sorry, one other thing about the other thing I often do sometimes in the midweek is I like to do a bit of a mixed session. So you saw in my one, a bit of marathon pace, some threshold intervals, and then a bit more marathon pace. Or sometimes I just do the threshold intervals and then a nice chunk of marathon pace. So sort of 4 or 5 miles marathon pace after the intervals. Then you're kind of simulating again, running marathon pace on quite tired legs. So that's another way that I like to put it in there if I'm not going to put it in the long run to get it in.
Joe, it's Noel. Thanks for a great presentation. Quick question. You mentioned the word steady a number of times, and I just wondered how you calibrate that to marathon pace, because everyone does it.
Yeah. So I've made a note to say this and I didn't say it. Yeah. Steady running. So my definition of steady running is something, as I say, I like to use RPE, rate of perceived exertion. So for me, on a scale, I always give athletes a scale 1 to 10 with a description of each one. So there are lots of variations on RPE scales, depending on whether you're using 6 to 20 or 1 to 10. So for me, I describe it as a comfortable effort, something which you're breathing slightly heavier, so slightly heavier than normal, but definitely not gasping for breath. And you could hold a reasonable conversation with somebody throughout the entire duration of the run. And then roughly, as I say, I'm looking for that stable heart rate throughout the run rather than it creeping up. That to me would be another sign that it's steady. And I tend to set it. So going back to Bernie's question, yes, I do start with a figure in my mind and a pace in my mind about what their target marathon time is. And then I tend to try and say, if I'm going to give people a pace, I tend to aim for a minute to a minute 30 slower than that marathon pace. Whether they stick to it or not is a bit of a different matter. But I do find that how well steady translates to marathon is actually tends to be related to how much volume you do across the week. So I coach a whole range of different runners, and I find bizarrely those that do more volume, so those that run 60 to 70 miles a week, are actually pretty good at doing steady running at a really much, as I say, that kind of pace that's lower than their mileage marathon pace. Often I think because they're actually quite tired, so they need to do that steady running because they need to recover. Those runners that don't do as much mileage fall into that temptation to do everything much faster. So those people that are only really running around, again, a bit of a ballpark and a bit of a generalization, but if you're only really running 25 to 30 miles a week, what I often find is your marathon pace tends to actually be slower than your steady pace, because you just don't have the endurance to lift it above that steady rate. So you can run that nice steady pace for 5 miles, 10 miles, maybe even 15 miles, but you can't sustain it for the marathon because you don't have the endurance behind you. So how the two relate partly depends to how steady you do the steady and how much endurance you've got to be able to sustain it over that longer period of time.